The snow came down in whispers, but it felt like a shout. It was the kind of snow that meant to stay, to bury the world in a clean, cold sheet of white, erasing everything that had come before. Out on the edge of Eileen Boone's land, it was already starting to stick. It covered the cracked wooden fence posts and the lonely goat tracks that were the only sign of life. Her little cabin stood against a wind-bitten rise, a small, stubborn knot of warmth in a world going cold. Inside, the hearth spit and crackled, throwing frantic shadows on the walls. But the fire couldn't touch the hollow space in Eileen's chest. It was a cold that had moved in a few years back and never left. She was halfway through warming a pot of goat's milk, the steam rising like a ghost in the dim light, when she heard it. A knock. It wasn't a sharp, urgent rap. It was a single, heavy thump. The sound of someone who didn't want to be heard but had no other choice. It was the sound of the end of the line. Eileen set the milk aside, her heart giving a strange, unfamiliar lurch. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. When she pulled it open, the cold didn't just seep in. It shoved past her skirts like an angry guest, bringing the smell of pine and frozen earth with it. But she barely noticed the cold. Because of him. He stood on her porch, a giant carved from canyon stone and winter. He was shirtless, barefoot in the snow that was already dusting his broad shoulders. His hair was long, pulled back in a single braid thick as a rope, and his skin was the color of the red earth, cracked raw by the wind. Muscles coiled across his chest, tight with a cold that would have killed a lesser man. He was a warrior. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the stillness that was more intimidating than any movement. But it wasn't the warrior that struck her dumb. It wasn't even the impossible sight of him standing barefoot in a gathering storm. It was the baby. The child was nestled against his massive shoulder, swaddled in a piece of worn deerskin. It was trembling, its tiny face flushed a dangerous, feverish red. Its lips were cracked and dry. The baby didn't cry. It was too weak for that now. It was past protesting. It was simply fading. Eileen's hand went to her own chest, a reflex she couldn't stop. The milk. It had come back months after her boy was stillborn, a cruel, useless miracle that had never quite gone away. She'd hidden it, been ashamed of it. A mother with milk, but no child. There wasn't a soul left for her to feed. Until now. She finally met the man's eyes. They were brown, deep, and bottomless, rimmed with thick lashes that caught the falling snowflakes like tiny, perfect spiderwebs. He didn't speak, he didn't plead. He just lowered his head, a gesture of profound defeat, and pointed a gentle finger toward the child. Then he mimed cradling something to his chest. The message was clearer than any words. Eileen's throat worked, but no sound came out. She swallowed, the sound loud in the sudden ringing silence. "You want me to feed her?" He didn't nod. He didn't have to. His silence was a physical weight, heavier than any plea. The wind howled around them, an audience holding its breath. Eileen stared at the baby, at its tiny, still form, and the hollow place inside her chest ached with a pain so sharp it was almost a comfort. It was the first thing she'd truly felt in years. She stepped aside. He had to duck low to get through the doorframe. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen, his shoulders so broad they blocked the firelight for a moment as he passed, plunging the room into shadow. As the warmth of the cabin hit the child, it let out a single, pathetic whimper, a sound like a mouse caught in a trap, and then fell silent again. Eileen closed the door, shutting out the storm. The world was gone. There was only this room, this fire, this man, and this dying child. "I won't ask questions," Eileen said, her voice a quiet rasp. Her hands were already trembling as she reached for a shawl. "But you'll take no more than one night. One night, and then you're gone." Still, he gave no answer. He moved to the farthest, darkest corner of the room, away from the fire, as if he knew he didn't belong in its light. He knelt, and gently, so gently, placed the baby into Eileen's waiting arms. It felt like he was placing a prayer into her trembling hands. Eileen looked down at the tiny creature. The baby's eyes fluttered behind its lids. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent. There was native blood in her. She could see it, but mixed with something else. The child was too light, far too still. But she wasn't gone. Not yet. She sat in the old rocking chair by the fire and with stiff, awkward movements, unbuttoned her blouse. It had been so long. The simple act felt foreign, like a memory from another life. She pressed the child to her breast, her own skin shockingly warm against the baby's cold cheek. "Come on, little one," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't you let this world take you yet. You fight." The baby's latch was weak at first, a feeble, searching thing. Then a flicker of instinct. It grew stronger. And then the sound filled the silent cabin, a soft, rhythmic suckling. It was the sound of life refusing to let go. It was the most beautiful sound Eileen had ever heard. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no noise. She wept in silence, for the son she'd lost, and for the daughter she was now, impossibly, saving. Across the room, the man didn't move. He sat on his knees, his massive arms resting on his thighs. He stared into the fire, but his eyes weren't really there. They were somewhere else. A distant battlefield, a birthing cave filled with sorrow, a place where warriors like him weren't allowed to mourn. After a long time, the quiet became too much to bear. "Does she have a name?" Eileen asked, her voice low. He blinked once. That was his only reply. She nodded, understanding. "Then I'll call her Willow," she said, "because she bends, but she hasn't broken. I'll call her Willow until you say different." For the next hour, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the baby's soft nursing, and the rising howl of the wind outside. The snow was coming down hard now, a blizzard blanketing the world. Eileen began to hum a lullaby her mother used to sing, the tune a fragile thread in the heavy silence. Willow dozed, her belly full, her breathing faint but steady against Eileen's chest. Eileen stole glances at the man. She saw the faint, silvery lines of scars across his collarbone. She saw the long, dark braid, still damp with melted snow, curling against the powerful muscles of his back. His hands were huge and calloused, resting open on his knees. They looked like they had forgotten how to clench into a fist. He looked younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 30. But the silence he wore aged him by decades. "I suppose you'll sleep there by the hearth," Eileen said, as the night pulled its dark coat over the land. "I have a cot, but I won't offer it to you." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe to remind herself he was a stranger, a danger. He didn't bristle. He didn't even look at her. He simply reached into a small leather satchel at his hip and pulled out a wooden rattle, carved with incredible care. He placed it gently on the floor beside the rocking chair, a silent offering. Then he lay down on the hard floorboards, without a blanket, crossing his arms over his chest and staring up at the dark ceiling beams. Eileen wrapped the baby in layers of warm wool and laid her in a wicker basket beside her own bed. Her heart was beating wildly. But it wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. It was the strange, unsettling, terrifying feeling of having a purpose again. She knew she wouldn't sleep. Hours passed. Outside, a coyote howled, a long, lonely cry that was answered by the wind. She thought of the town, of the preacher's wife who had called her cursed after she'd buried her son, of the looks that followed her through the mercantile, the whispers that she was barren, broken. They would flay her alive if they knew she had an Apache warrior sleeping on her floor. But in this small, warm cabin, the only judgment came from the storm outside. And the storm had seen worse. Just before the fire burned down to glowing embers, Eileen sat up. She couldn't stand the silence anymore. "You don't talk much," she murmured into the darkness. A long pause stretched between them, then a voice, rough and low, like rocks grinding together. "Words take trust." She met his gaze across the dim room. She could just make out the dark shape of him on the floor. Then I won't ask for more, she said softly. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It was a shared quiet. Then he spoke again, the words pulled from some deep, painful place. Her mother bled in the winter. I had no milk. Only my legs. Eileen swallowed hard, the story painting a brutal picture in her mind. She was Comanche, he added, and the words landed like stones in a still pond. Comanche, not Apache. Everything clicked into place, the risk, the desperation. He hadn't just loved a woman from another tribe, a taboo that could get a man killed. He now carried her half-blood child across lands that were hostile to both their peoples. He was a man with no home, no allies, and a past that was hunting him. You walked a long way, she whispered, awestruck. He nodded once in the darkness. She's warm now, Eileen said gently, her gaze falling on the basket where Willow slept. You did the right thing. His eyes closed for just a moment, a flicker of vulnerability that was gone as quickly as it appeared. And in that moment, Eileen understood. He hadn't come to her door asking to be saved. He had come hoping, quietly, not to be turned away. Again. The fire flickered, casting one last wave of orange light across the room. Eileen tucked the blankets tighter around Willow, her fingers brushing the baby's impossibly soft hair. She stood up and walked to the front door, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She slid the heavy iron bolt into place. It wasn't to keep him in, it was to keep the whole damn world out. Her hand lingered on the cold iron. One night, she whispered to herself. But as she turned and looked at the sleeping child and the silent warrior guarding her, she knew it was a lie. Heaven help her. She had already said too much. Outside, the snow kept falling, relentless and deep. But inside the cabin, for the first time in a very long time, the storm in Eileen Boone's heart had gone quiet. The door wouldn't be locked again for the rest of that winter. But she didn't know that yet. She didn't know that the real storm hadn't even begun. Morning didn't so much arrive as unfold, a slow, silvery thing that crept across the floorboards. Eileen was the first to stir. The air was cold enough to see her breath, a small white cloud in front of her face as she knelt by the hearth and gently stoked the embers back to life. The man hadn't moved. Taza, she decided to call him in her mind, though he hadn't offered a name. He was still lying on the floor, as still as a figure carved from stone. She had tossed a blanket toward him in the middle of the night, but he hadn't used it. It lay folded near his head. She watched him for a moment. There was a strange nobility in his stillness. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, something worn into the very fabric of him. He looked like a man who knew the world would never apologize for what it took, and so he had stopped asking it for anything at all. A soft whimper came from the basket. Eileen crossed the room, her movements fluid and sure now. She lifted Willow into her arms and settled back into the rocking chair, tucking the baby to her chest. The familiar life-affirming sound of suckling filled the room as the flames in the hearth caught, sending shadows dancing on the log walls. That's when Taza stirred. Not with a jolt, but a slow awakening. He opened one eye, then the other. He sat up slowly, a slight wince crossing his features as his back stretched, but he made no sound. His gaze went immediately to Eileen and the baby. She made it through the night, Eileen said softly, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. You brought her in time. He inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement, but the crushing weight on his shoulders didn't lift. She could see it more clearly now in the daylight. There was something broken in him, a crack that ran deeper than grief or war. He was a man who had watched something sacred die in his arms and didn't know what parts of himself had died along with it. Eileen stood and moved toward the fire. There's stew, she offered, gesturing to the iron pot hanging over the flames. Goat and beans. It'll fill you. He rose from the floor, a single fluid motion of coiled power, and knelt by the fire. He took the wooden bowl she offered, his large, calloused fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact sent a strange jolt through her. He ate quickly and silently, his eyes fixed on the fire. Eileen didn't watch him. She just rocked the baby, humming her mother's lullaby, letting the comfortable quiet stretch between them. This was a new kind of silence, not empty, but full. After he finished, he placed the empty bowl aside. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out something wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth. He laid it carefully on the small table between them and unfolded it. It was a bracelet. It was made of glass beads, blue, white, and red, strung in a complex pattern she didn't recognize. The leather it was tied to was worn soft, darkened by the touch of hands over many years. Eileen stared at it, her heart tightening in her chest. "Hers?" she whispered. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The Comanche woman," she said, stating the fact. "Hannah," he said. The name was a rough whisper, the first personal word he'd offered. Her name was Hannah. The quiet in the room deepened. Eileen ran her fingers gently over the beads, not to claim the bracelet, but just to feel it, to honor the woman who had worn it. "Did you love her?" His answer came without hesitation, simple and profound. "I followed her across 7 rivers," he said, his eyes still on the fire. "And I stayed, though her brothers would have skinned me for it." Eileen's throat burned. A love like that. A love that crossed borders and defied tribes. "She gave me this to wear," he added, his voice dropping even lower. "But I kept it, for Willow." Eileen looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. "Willow," she whispered again, the name feeling more right each time she said it. "It suits her. Strong and bendable, still standing, even after the storm." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin shutters, as if in agreement. Eileen gently laid the beaded bracelet on the table, next to the cradle basket she'd woven last winter out of a loneliness so deep it had turned to craft. "If you're staying another day," she said, her voice careful, measured, "I have work to do, goats to milk, firewood to split. You're welcome to help." He rose without a word of argument and followed her out into the sharp morning air. The cold bit at her skin, but Eileen kept her sleeves rolled up and her jaw set. This was her land, her life. She would not be made to feel weak in it. He took the axe from her without being asked. He handled it with a frightening ease. As he began to split logs, the rhythmic thump crack echoing in the crisp air, she saw the scars on his back and shoulders again. They weren't old, they weren't ceremonial marks. These were the ragged, ugly scars left by man-made blades. Iron blades. She didn't ask. She couldn't. She moved between the small barn and the goat pen, fetching the pails, her hands working automatically. But she kept one eye on him. The sound of the axe became a kind of heartbeat for the morning, steady and powerful. When she returned from the barn with a pail of frothing milk, he had already stacked 2 neat, tall piles of firewood, enough for a week. "You work fast," she said, impressed despite herself. "I don't rest well," he replied, not looking at her. They shared a midday meal in the same comfortable silence. Goat cheese, dried apples, and cornbread from 2 days before. Willow slept in her basket by the hearth, her tiny cheeks flushed with warmth, her little fists opening and closing as if she were dreaming of gripping something she had never held. After they ate, Taza stood and walked to the door. For a heart-stopping moment, Eileen thought he was leaving, that he would just walk back out into the wilderness and disappear forever. But he only stepped outside for a moment. He returned a few minutes later with a bundle of pine branches and a few gnarled cedar roots. He sat on the floor and, without a word, began to carve. Eileen watched him from across the room. His hands, which had wielded the axe with such brutal efficiency, now moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He shaved thin curls of wood from the pine, shaping the pieces with a small, sharp knife. His fingers, rough and dark, shaped legs for the cradle basket. He smoothed and sanded each piece with a stone he fetched from his satchel. She had never seen a man build something gentle before. Her late husband, Jed, had only ever built fences to keep things in and walls to keep people out. By nightfall, the cradle was finished. It had no nails. Every piece was fitted together with tongue and groove joints, a perfect, seamless whole. He set it beside the fire with a quiet reverence. Willow stirred, her eyes blinking open. Eileen gently lifted her from the simple wicker basket and placed her inside the new cradle. The baby lay there quietly, looking up at the two of them, her dark eyes seeming to understand that this wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a promise. "You made that for her," Eileen said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "For you both," he answered, his eyes meeting hers. She had to turn her face away, blinking fast against a sudden sting of tears. Outside, the wind had finally died down. The storm, it seemed, was taking a breath. "You lost a child, too," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A quiet, certain recognition that passed from one wounded soul to another. Eileen froze. He hadn't asked. He had just known. She turned back to him and nodded slowly, the truth a heavy weight in her throat. 3 winters ago, a boy. He came too early. I held him just long enough to name him. The name was a secret she had never spoken aloud. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just bowed his head once, a gesture of shared sorrow that meant more than any platitude. "I stayed in town for a while after," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out of her. "I tried to pretend that life just goes on, but they see you different once you've buried a piece of yourself. Especially if you're a woman. Folks want you to move on, smile again. They want you to show them you're healed." She let out a ragged breath. "But there's no healing, is there? There's only carrying." Taza's dark eyes never left hers. "They stopped looking me in the eye," Eileen whispered. "They whispered that I was cursed, that no man should ever touch me again." His voice was like gravel, rubbed smooth by grief. "They fear what grief makes." She exhaled, a long, uneven sound. "And what's that?" "Real," he said. The word hung in the air between them. Real. She looked down at Willow, sleeping peacefully in the cradle he had built. "I didn't think I'd ever feel useful again." "You are," he said simply. Then he added, "She eats like she wants to live." A soft, unexpected laugh escaped Eileen's lips. It felt rusty. "Then she takes after someone." For the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch his mouth. It was just a faint line, a brief easing of the grim set of his jaw. But it was there, and it was devastating. As they prepared for the night, Eileen laid a thick quilt by the hearth again. "If you mean to stay another night," she murmured, her back to him, "I won't stop you." He didn't answer, but he didn't leave. She watched from the shadows as he took his place on the floor, cross-legged beside the cradle. His large hand rested near the wooden frame, protective, silent, a guardian in the night. Eileen blew out the oil lamp and stood in the doorway of her small bedroom, watching the firelight flicker on the new cradle. "You never asked what her mother's name was," he said suddenly into the darkness. She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." He turned his head slightly, his profile etched by the dying fire. "Her name was Hana. It means spirit warrior. She died with her hands on my chest and told me not to be angry." Eileen stepped closer, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. "And did you listen?" "I tried," he said, after a long, heavy beat. "And what about now?" she whispered. His voice was almost inaudible. "Now, I try not to disappear." She understood that more than he could ever know. She, too, had been trying not to disappear for years. As she finally stepped away into the darkness of her room, she carried his quiet confession with her. She folded it up and tucked it against her ribs, a letter she had never been sent but understood completely. Behind her, Willow stirred in the cradle her father had made, and the fire, low but steady, kept on burning between them. The world outside was quiet for now, but Eileen had a sickening feeling it was just the calm before a different kind of storm. A storm of whispers and judgment and hate. And it was heading straight for her door. She just didn't know how right she was. She thought the threat was from the town. She had no idea that the man sleeping on her floor was being hunted by something far older and far more dangerous. The silence couldn't last. By the fourth morning, the news had leaked out of the woods and into the town, spreading like creek water through cracked, dry ground. It wasn't the kind of news people spoke aloud, not at first. It was a thing of glances, of whispers behind cupped hands, of aprons pulled tighter and gazes dropped. Eileen Boone, the cursed widow, had taken in a savage. Worse, she was letting him sleep under her roof. And the worst, most damnable sin of all, she was nursing his half-breed baby at her own breast, like it was her own. No one rode out to the cabin, not yet. The fear was still greater than the anger. But when Eileen hitched her goat to the small cart and rode into town to trade her milk for flour and salt, the silence became a weapon. It was a sharp, invisible blade that cut her from the moment she tied the reins. She felt it first at the mercantile. The bell above the door jangled, the same sound it made every week. But this time, no one looked up. The clerk, a lean, sour-faced man named Abel Hurst, who used to save the sweetest rhubarb from his garden for her, now busied himself stacking tins of beans into a precarious tower. "We're not accepting milk today, Mrs. Boone," he said, his back still to her. "It's good milk, Abel," she replied, her voice steady. She held up the glass jar. The cream was thick at the top, rich and yellow. "My goats are healthy." "I said we're not taking it." She swallowed the knot of anger and hurt in her throat. "You used to pay double for my cream." At that he finally turned. His eyes were small and hard, like chips of flint. "Used to be. You weren't shacked up with a redskin giant, Eileen." The words cracked through the store like a whip. A woman near the bolt of calico gasped and clutched her daughter's shoulder. The air grew thick and heavy. Eileen met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I am not shacked up with him," she said, her voice dangerously even. "He brought a child to my door. A baby. She was starving. I fed her. That is all." "That ain't all," Hurst sneered. "We all know about your dead husband, Jed. Know he left you with nothing but that scrap of land and a pile of debt. My debt, to be specific." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone in the store could still hear. "He owed me a considerable sum. I've been patient, but my patience is wearing thin, especially now that you're harboring him." A twist of ice formed in Eileen's gut. This wasn't just about prejudice. It was about something older, uglier. It was about greed. "Jed's debts are his own," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Not according to the law, they ain't," Hurst said, a triumphant smirk playing on his thin lips. "That land is security. I've got the papers to prove it. Maybe it's time I collected." Eileen stared at him, her mind reeling. Jed had never told her. He'd always been secretive about money. But this was a betrayal from beyond the grave. Hurst didn't just want her gone. He wanted her land. She said nothing more. There was nothing to say. She set the jar of milk down gently on the counter, a silent act of defiance. Then she turned and walked out, her back straight, her head held high. The bell clanged angrily behind her. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of righteous fury and cold, creeping fear. Her husband hadn't just left her alone, he'd left her trapped. When she arrived, Taza was splitting firewood again, his powerful form moving with that same relentless rhythm. He was shirtless, as always, sweat glinting on his collarbones despite the winter chill. He paused, axe in hand, when he saw the look on her face. Eileen didn't speak. She walked past him, her boots crunching in the snow. She set the small, half-empty bag of flour on the table and sank down into the rocking chair beside Willow's cradle. The baby was awake, her dark eyes blinking up at the ceiling rafters. "She laughed today," Eileen murmured, her voice thick. "When I tickled her feet, it was just a little sound, like a hiccup and a giggle got mixed up together." Taza stepped into the cabin, filling the doorway. He leaned the axe against the frame and watched her, his expression unreadable. "She will live," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes," Eileen whispered, her gaze fixed on the child. A fierce, protective love surged through her, so powerful it almost knocked the breath from her lungs. "But I'm not sure we will." He moved closer, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. He lowered his large frame to the floor beside her chair, his arms resting on his knees. "They came?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not yet. But they're whispering, and when folks like that whisper, it means they're gathering their courage, or their hate." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a new, hard-won clarity. "The man at the store, Abel Hurst. He says my husband owed him money. He says he has a claim on this land." Taza's gaze never left Willow, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. A man with a paper claim was more dangerous than a man with a gun. That night, neither of them slept. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands on the far wall. Eileen sat wrapped in a shawl, staring into the orange glow, her face a mask of calm she didn't feel. She had survived loss. She had survived loneliness. She had survived the quiet betrayal of a town that had turned its back on her. But this was different. This wasn't just being abandoned. This felt like being hunted. Just as the dawn cracked, pale and brittle over the snow-covered hills, she heard it. The thunder of hooves, pounding down her path. Not one horse. Several. Eileen was on her feet in an instant. Her first instinct was to bar the door, but she knew it was useless. She opened it before they could knock. Marshal Grayley dismounted first, a tall, weary-looking man whose face was chapped by the wind. Dust shook from the brim of his hat as he looked her over, his eyes lingering on her worn dress and tired face. He was flanked by 2 deputies, their hands hovering near the guns on their hips. "Morning, Mrs. Boone," the marshal said, his voice gravelly. She just nodded. "Marshal." "We've had some talk in town," he said, not unkindly. "Reckon you know what kind." "I do." He shifted his weight, his gaze flicking to the dark space behind her. "Folks are worried. A man like that, an Apache, after everything that's happened in these parts, it makes people uneasy." Eileen didn't flinch. "He has done nothing to harm anyone." "Might be," Grayley conceded. "But it's what people fear he might do. Fear's a powerful thing." Just then, Taza stepped into the doorway behind her. He stood there, bare-chested and silent, as tall as a barn post, his eyes calm and steady. He carried no weapon. He didn't need to. He stood there like a mountain, refusing to bow to the wind. One of the deputies flinched, his hand dropping to the handle of his pistol. "Easy, son," Grayley said, holding out an arm without taking his eyes off Taza. "No need for a show. We just came to see if the rumors were true. Now we've seen." He looked back at Eileen. "You'd be wise to send him on his way, ma'am. For everyone's sake." Eileen glanced back at Taza, then at Willow, who was beginning to stir in her cradle, her tiny fists opening and closing. She turned back to the marshal, her chin held high. "I'd sooner send the sun on its way," she replied, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. That silenced them. The marshal stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something, respect, pity, in his eyes. He tipped his hat. "You've made your choice, then." "I have." "Then I reckon the town will make theirs," he said. And the words were not a threat, but a sad, simple statement of fact. As they mounted their horses and rode away, Eileen felt a cold dread settle in her marrow. She turned back to Taza. "I don't scare easy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," he answered, his voice low. "But this is different than grief. This is hate." He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow. "I have lived inside it," he said quietly. "You learn to breathe small." The rest of the morning passed in a tense, unspoken understanding. She churned butter with violent, jerky motions. He fixed a section of the goat fence that didn't need fixing. Willow slept and gurgled and wriggled in her blanket, blissfully unaware that the world outside her cradle had tilted on its axis. By mid-afternoon, Eileen found Taza behind the barn. He was sitting in the dirt, carving something from a piece of pine, another gift, another way to speak without using words. She sat on an overturned bucket across from him and watched his hands work. "What are you making?" she asked. "A feather, for her cradle." She watched the thin curls of wood fall to the frozen earth. "Why do you stay?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind. "You could run. With the baby. They would never catch you." He didn't look up from his carving. "Because she knows my scent now," he said simply. "My voice. If I walk away, she cries." Eileen looked down at her own hands, at the calluses on her palms. "I used to think I wasn't meant to mother anyone," she whispered. "I thought God had seen something in me he didn't trust. But when she cries, and I soothe her, I feel like I'm being rewritten." Taza stopped carving. He lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark and unreadable, yet there was a softness around the edges she hadn't seen before. "You were never broken," he said, his voice quiet but certain, only buried. That night, a storm rolled in low over the distant hills. Not snow this time, but the angry rumble of thunder, a summer storm trying to chase out the last breath of winter. Eileen stood by the window, watching the horizon flash with silent lightning. She heard the sound before she saw it, a sharp thwack against the cabin wall, a stone, then another. She stepped outside into the cold, damp air. 3 of them. Teenagers from the town, their faces pale and cruel in the gloom. One held a slingshot. The other 2 just laughed and pointed. "Savage lover!" one of them shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and bravado. Eileen didn't respond. She just stood there on her porch, the cold wind tugging at her skirts, and stared at them. Then Taza came out. The boys froze. The laughter died in their throats. Even from 100 feet away, his presence was overwhelming. Too large, too silent, too still. He didn't chase them. He didn't shout. He just stepped up beside Eileen and looked at them. He just stood there. And they ran. They scrambled over each other in their haste to get away, disappearing into the darkness like frightened rabbits. Inside, Willow began to cry, startled by the noise. Eileen picked her up from the cradle and pressed her against her shoulder, her own heartbeat finally starting to slow beneath the comforting warmth of the child. "I used to believe this cabin was the loneliest place on earth," she murmured, rocking the baby gently. "Now I think it might be the only safe one." Taza turned toward her, his face in shadow, but his eyes said everything he could not. "Tomorrow," Eileen said softly, her voice gaining strength. "They may come back, harder, with louder voices and sharper things than stones." "I know," he said. "But tonight," she said, looking from the baby in her arms to the man standing beside her, "tonight, we have peace." He nodded. "And fire." They sat again by the hearth, Willow sleeping peacefully between them. The carved wooden feather now rested beside her cradle, a silent guardian. The storm rumbled on in the distance, but for now, its fury had not reached them. For now, that was enough. But as Eileen looked into the flames, she saw Abel Hurst's greedy eyes. She saw the fear on the marshal's face. She knew this small pocket of peace was fragile. It was a soap bubble, beautiful and shimmering, but destined to pop. And when it did, she feared what would be left in its place. She didn't yet realize that Taza had secrets of his own. Secrets that were riding on the same wind as the coming storm, drawing closer with every passing hour. He wasn't just running from the white man's hate. He was running from his own people. And soon, both worlds were going to collide right on her doorstep. Spring didn't arrive with a grand announcement. It came quietly, unsure of itself, like a visitor knocking on the door of a house it wasn't certain it was welcome in. The snow melted away into memory, soaking into the dark earth with the soft hush of forgiveness. Eileen noticed the small, brave signs of its return everywhere. the stubborn daffodils pushing their green shoots through the fence line, the goats growing restless for open pasture, and Willow's tiny legs kicking with a newfound strength in the cradle Taza had made. Their days fell into a rhythm, simple but sacred. Eileen would rise before the sun, stoke the fire, and then feed the child. The moment she settled into the rocking chair, she'd hear the soft creak of the door as Taza left to fetch fresh water from the creek. He never asked. She never ordered. It was a life built not on rules, but on a kind of unspoken grace. A shared, silent understanding. One morning, as Eileen held Willow to her chest, she felt it. A change. Two small, determined hands were clutching at the fabric of her blouse. The baby's hunger no longer felt like a desperate, fragile thing. It was a demand, a pure, simple need. Willow had filled out. Her cheeks, once pale and sunken, were now pink and full. Her dark eyes, which had been dull with weakness, were now wide and bright and searching. "She knows me now," Eileen whispered to the quiet cabin. She looked over to see Taza mending a leather strap for the goat pen. He paused, his hands still, listening. "She knows my scent, my arms, my voice." A strange thought bloomed in her mind, both wonderful and terrifying. "She belongs here," she said, more to herself than to him. "But I don't know what that makes me." Later that evening, as dusk draped a shawl of gold and purple over the hills, Eileen set a tin plate in front of Taza. It was a simple meal: cornbread, dandelion greens she'd found by the creek, and a slice of goat cheese. But it felt like a feast. It was a meal shared, not just handed over in a silent transaction of need and duty. "You built a gate for the western pasture," she said, sitting across the small table from him. He nodded, chewing his cornbread slowly. "I didn't ask you to," she said. "No. I wouldn't have stopped you either." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "You never have." She took a slow, deep breath, gathering her courage. "You stay because of her." It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "And me?" The question slipped out, small and fragile, a thing she hadn't meant to say aloud. Taza didn't answer right away. He didn't look away either. He just held her gaze from across the table, and in the quiet space between them, something shifted. Something unspoken was acknowledged. That night Eileen lay awake in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the faint crackle of the dying fire, the wind whispering secrets to the roof, Willow's soft coos and murmurs from the cradle. And one other sound, a deep, steady breath, coming from the man sleeping by the hearth. She found herself timing her own breathing to his. She wondered when the silence of the cabin had stopped feeling like a suffocating blanket and started feeling like a comforting embrace. She hadn't noticed the shift. She only knew the result. The hollow place in her chest wasn't empty anymore. The next morning, the light that filtered through the single window was soft and kind. Willow was lying on a thick blanket near the fire, kicking her legs. Suddenly, with a grunt of tremendous effort, she rolled over onto her belly. She let out a squeal of surprised triumph. Eileen laughed, a full, happy sound. She reached down to help the baby, but Willow pushed herself up onto her chubby elbows, her little face lit with fierce concentration. "She's growing so fast," Eileen said, her heart swelling. Taza glanced up from the wooden spoon he was carving. "You feed her strong," he said. "No," Eileen corrected him gently, watching as Willow managed to scoot forward a single inch. "She chose to live. I just held her long enough for her to notice." Later that day, Eileen was standing at the butter churn, her hands covered in fragrant buttermilk. She was wiping them on her apron when she heard it. A sound, a whisper, a thread of a word, so delicate it might have been a trick of the wind. "Mama." Eileen froze. The world stopped turning. She turned around slowly, her hands frozen mid-air. Willow was sitting up in her cradle. Her chubby little arms were reaching up toward Eileen, and her face was alight with a radiant, gummy smile. "Mama," she said again. It was clear, unmistakable, clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. Eileen felt her knees go weak. She dropped down beside the cradle, one hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Across the room, Taza stood as still as a statue, the half-carved spoon forgotten in his hand. She called me." Eileen couldn't finish the sentence. "I heard," Taza said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was heavy, and it was human. Eileen scooped the child into her arms, burying her face in the baby's soft, dark curls. She breathed her in, the sweet, clean scent of her. She didn't cry this time. She just held her, feeling the solid, warm weight of her. "She knows," Eileen whispered against Willow's hair. "She chose me." Taza took a slow step forward, then another. He stopped beside them, looking down at the child in her arms. "She knew," he said, his voice a low rumble, "before we did." Outside, the goats bleated and the wind tugged at the door, but nothing could break the spell inside the cabin. Nothing could touch the profound stillness that had settled in Eileen's heart. "She's not of my blood," Eileen said, looking up at him, needing him to understand. "No," Taza agreed, his dark eyes soft. "She's of your heart." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the sturdy cradle, the new spoon, the well-mended fence. "And of yours." "I gave her what I could," he said, his voice rough with humility. "But she reaches for you." "She calls for you too," Eileen replied softly. "Just not with words. Not yet." That night, after Willow was asleep, Eileen did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She pulled the small, dusty cedar box from its hiding place beneath the floorboards in her room. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside lay her son's tiny, unworn leather shoes, a faded blue ribbon, and the soft linen birth cloth she had wrapped him in. "I buried him without a name," she said, her voice a raw whisper. Taza had followed her into the room and was crouching silently beside her. "I couldn't bring myself to speak it aloud. It felt too final." She lifted the yellowed cloth from the box and held it in her lap. I think it's time I let him rest. He was a part of me, but he's not all of me anymore." She reached back into the box, took out the faded blue ribbon, and walked over to Willow's cradle. She gently tied the ribbon to one of the carved wooden posts, a bridge between the son she had lost and the daughter she had found. Taza said nothing. He only bowed his head and pressed his open palm flat against the floorboards, a silent gesture of honor for the memory buried beneath. The very next morning, Eileen walked into town, not because she needed to trade, because she wanted to. She carried Willow on her hip, the baby swaddled in a bright blue quilt, her little head peeking out from under a bonnet. Eileen's hair was tied back neatly. Her dress was clean and pressed. She walked with her head held high. Taza followed 2 paces behind her. He wasn't looming. He was just there. A steady, silent presence. The town went still. People stopped what they were doing. Mrs. Barton, who used to share apple pie with Eileen after church services, froze with her hand on a sack of flour. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, muttered something sharp and ugly under her breath and pulled her skirts away as if Eileen were contagious. Eileen didn't flinch. She walked straight into the mercantile. The bell jangled. Abel Hurst was behind the counter, pretending to reorganize packets of seeds. He looked up, his face souring when he saw her. Then his eyes fell on the baby, then on the giant of a man who stood just inside the door. "I need oats," Eileen said, her voice clear and strong. "And lye." Hurst just stared at her. "We're closed." "There's no sign on the door that says so," she replied calmly. He continued to stare, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, and then Eileen did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I fed a starving baby, Abel," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "The rest of it simply does not matter. She turned and walked out of the store without waiting for a reply, leaving him sputtering in her wake. Outside on the dusty street, the wind had picked up, brushing loose strands of hair against her cheeks. Willow, nestled safely in her arms, let out a soft, happy sound. "Mama." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, proud, a declaration. Taza looked at her, his eyes unreadable. Then, very slowly, he nodded. Eileen shifted the child higher on her hip. "You hear that?" she said to him softly, for his ears only. "You're not just her protector." "I know," he said. "You're not just passing through." "No." She stopped walking and looked him full in the face, her eyes wide and searching. "Then don't leave." "I won't," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "Not until she's safe." "And when is that?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked down at Willow, then back at Eileen. "When she forgets what hunger feels like." Eileen took a step closer, closing the small space between them. "And me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question of fear this time, but of hope. The fragile hope of someone who had never dared to ask for anything for herself. Taza didn't answer with words. That night, when they returned to the cabin, he moved Willow's cradle from its spot by the hearth and placed it right beside Eileen's bed. And when Willow cried out for milk just before the dawn, it was both of them who reached for her in the darkness. But their newfound peace was a fragile thing. Eileen saw the hatred in Abel Hurst's eyes. She saw the fear in the faces of the townspeople, and Taza knew that the silence from his past was not a sign of peace. It was a sign of a hunt. A band of Comanche riders, led by Hana's vengeful brother, Kills the Enemy, had been tracking him for months. They believed he had stolen Hana and dishonored their family. They did not know about the child, but they were getting closer. And when they found him, they would not be coming for a conversation. They would be coming for blood. The storm was not over. The worst was yet to come. The rain didn't come gently. It didn't whisper or weep. It tore through the sky with a roar, cracking through the clouds like bones snapping. Thunder rolled across the hills, not as a distant rumble, but as a physical blow that shook the little cabin to its foundations. Wind slammed into the walls with the force of a battering ram, making the shutters rattle and the goats cry out in their pen. Eileen stood by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around a sleeping Willow, watching the storm turn the world into a churning vortex of gray and black. Behind her, Taza laid another log on the fire. His movements were slow and sure, as always, but his eyes kept drifting to the door, then to the storm-lashed window, then back to the door. Something had shifted in the air, something deeper and more dangerous than the weather. "They'll come today," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Eileen turned to face him. "The town?" He nodded once, his expression grim. "They've watched. They've waited. But the child has grown now. You've claimed her. In their eyes, you've crossed a line." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "They'll say it ain't right." Eileen pressed Willow's soft, warm cheek to her own, drawing strength from the small, solid weight in her arms. "And what will you do?" she asked, her voice steady. "What will you do if they come for her?" Taza looked at her, and the firelight caught the ridges of the old scars on his shoulders, making them gleam like silver rivers. "Stand," he said. The single word held a world of meaning. "You don't have to fight for me," she said, though a part of her desperately wanted him to. "I won't fight them," he said softly, his eyes finding hers. "But I won't vanish." The knock came at high noon, just as the storm reached its peak. It wasn't a knock that asked for permission. It was a hard, loud, righteous banging on the door, the sound of a mob that believed God was on its side. Eileen's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched Willow tighter, her first instinct to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. Taza moved ahead of her. He didn't pick up a weapon. He didn't even put on a shirt. He walked to the door as he was, bare-chested and silent, as if he meant to face down the storm with nothing but his own skin. He pulled the door open. Marshal Grayley stood on the porch, his face grim, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He was flanked by 3 other men, grim-faced townsmen deputized for the occasion, their shotguns held loosely but ready. Behind them, huddled under the dripping eaves of the porch, was a small, angry cluster of onlookers. Eileen recognized Abel Hurst at the front, his face a mask of triumphant righteousness. At least a dozen people, their faces pale and set in the gray light. "Afternoon, Eileen," the marshal said, his voice flat and tired. "We won't cross your floor unless you invite us. But we've come for the child." Taza didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply filled the doorway, an immovable mountain of flesh and bone. Eileen stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She moved to stand beside Taza, a small, fierce figure next to his towering one. "She's mine," she said, her voice ringing out over the roar of the rain. "She's Comanche, ma'am," Grayley argued, his gaze shifting uncomfortably between Eileen and Taza. "She belongs with her own kind." "She was born of a Comanche mother," Eileen shot back, her voice rising with a righteous fury she didn't know she possessed. "But she was fed from my breast. She has laughed in my arms. She knows my voice. I have buried one child in this earth. I have lived through that hell, and now I have held another one who lived because of me. That makes her mine." The marshal's jaw clenched. "You're no tribe, Eileen. You've no legal claim." "I have every claim that matters," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "She's alive, she's loved, she's safe. What other claim is there?" The crowd behind the marshal murmured, shifting uneasily. Her words, so raw and true, had struck a chord. Then a new voice broke through the tension. A frail but firm voice from the back of the crowd. "Let the woman speak." Heads turned. It was old Mrs. Bonham, a gray-haired, stooped woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She pushed her way slowly to the front. "I lost a boy to the fever when he was 3, she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Never held another, never felt my arms feel full again." She looked straight at Marshal Grayley. "That woman in there fed a starving child and made her laugh again. Since when is that a sin in this town?" The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "She's keeping a savage under her roof, an animal." "Then so be it," Mrs. Bonham snapped back, her eyes flashing. "That animal ain't the first man in this valley to kill another, I'd wager. But he might be the only one who ever built a cradle with his own 2 hands. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The marshal looked uncertain now. The men beside him glanced at each other, their certainty wavering. The righteous mob was beginning to fracture. "She is safer here than she would be anywhere else," Eileen said, pressing her advantage, her voice low and fierce. "And he is not just her guardian." She took a deep breath. "He is her father." A long, heavy silence followed, broken only by the drumming of the rain. And then, as if on cue, Willow, who had been nestled quietly in Eileen's arms, reached out. Her chubby little hands grasped for the mountain of a man standing beside her. "Mama," she said first, her clear little voice cutting through the tension. Then she turned her head, her bright eyes finding Taza. "Dada!" The sound broke something. In Marshal Grayley, in the wind, in every hostile face watching from the porch. It was a sound so pure, so simple, so undeniably true, that it shattered their hate. Taza stepped forward. He took the child from Eileen's arms not with force, but with a reverence and gentleness that was breathtaking to behold. He folded her against his broad, bare chest, and the baby immediately snuggled in, safe from the storm. Eileen moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, the 2 of them a united front. "You all have choices to make," she said, her voice calm now, facing the crowd. "But we have already made ours. We are not asking for your blessing. We are simply telling you that we are a family. You don't have to understand it, but you will have to live with it." For a long moment, the marshal looked like he might argue. He looked at Hurst's furious face, then at Mrs. Bonham's steady gaze, then back at the man, the woman, and the child in the doorway. His shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him. He stepped back from the door. "Let the record show," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "that we came. We asked, and you answered." No one else spoke. Abel Hurst shot Eileen a look of pure venom, but he was alone now. The crowd parted, their anger dissolved by the simple truth of a child's love. The deputized men lowered their shotguns. One by one they turned away and trudged back through the mud and rain, their righteous crusade a failure. When Eileen finally shut the door, the silence that filled the cabin was louder than the thunder had ever been. She watched as Taza carefully placed Willow into her cradle, his large hands impossibly gentle. Her own heart was still thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Taza stood near the fire, his back to her, unmoving. "You stayed," she whispered. He nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "You've never asked me for anything," she said, her voice catching. "No, but I'm going to ask you for something now." He turned slowly to face her. She took a hesitant step closer to him, her whole body trembling. "Stay," she whispered. "Stay longer." His hand came up, and his rough thumb brushed gently against her cheek, just under her eye, wiping away a tear she hadn't even realized she'd shed. The touch was electric, a spark in the quiet room. "Not as a guest," she breathed, her eyes locked on his. He shook his head slowly. "Not as a burden." "Then how?" she asked, her voice full of a hope that was both terrifying and wonderful. She reached out, took his large, calloused hand in both of her small ones, and placed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. He could feel its wild, frantic beating. "As a husband," she said. Taza didn't speak. He didn't need to. He leaned forward, and he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or urgency. It was a kiss of reverence, of arrival. It was the sealing of a sacred, unspoken promise. Later that evening, long after the storm had spent its fury and the world outside smelled of clean earth and damp cedar, they stood before the fire. Eileen had braided her hair and woven into it the faded blue ribbon that had once been wrapped around the memory of her son. She wore a clean, white apron over her simple dress. Taza stood beside her, barefoot on the wooden floor, his long, dark braid tied back with a simple leather thong. There were no witnesses but the child sleeping peacefully in her cradle. And that was enough. They said no vows. They simply held each other's hands, with the child between them, and in the warm, flickering firelight, something ancient and eternal passed between them. They had forged a family not out of blood or law, but out of shared loss, shared hope, and a shared, stubborn will to survive. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need music. It only needed breath. It only needed belonging. It only needed home. And for the first time in 3 long, lonely years, Eileen Boone slept without fear. Not because the world outside her door had suddenly grown kinder, but because the world inside her home had grown stronger. With the daughter she had saved at her breast, and the man she had never expected to find standing beside her, she was no longer a victim of the storm. She was the calm at its center. If you've ever had to stand before the world with nothing but the truth in your heart and love in your arms, you know what it means to be truly brave. And if you enjoyed this story of courage and unlikely family, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because love has a way of knocking when you least expect it. Sometimes it arrives shirtless, barefoot in the snow, and carrying a miracle.